In the mountains of western Virginia, where the fog dances between centenary pines and time seems to have stopped in 1920, there exists a place America preferred to forget. Odd, a small rural community in the Appalachians, has become synonymous with what modern society considers an absolute taboo: generations of marriages between direct relatives. Flanked by rusty trailers and wooden houses that challenge the laws of gravity, the dirt road leading to the Whitaker family property is narrow and irregular. Kilometers before you arrive at the destination, GPS stops operating. It is as if technology itself refused to recognize this place's existence. In 2020, photographer and documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter ventured into these mountains with a camera and a question that haunted his mind. How can an entire family survive decades of consanguineous marriages? The reality he found challenges any fiction. The Whitaker family is not just an isolated case of consanguinity. They represent the extreme result of generations of geographical isolation, absolute poverty, and traditions perpetuated for more than a century. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie Whitaker are brothers who carry in their bodies and minds the physical and mental marks of a genetic lineage closed over itself. The oldest of the brothers, Ray, has severe physical malformations. His head is disproportionately small in relation to his body, a condition known as microcephaly. He communicates only through grunts and gestures, his intellectual capacity severely compromised. The only sister, Lorraine, has obvious facial deformities and motor difficulties that prevent her from walking normally. Despite being able to speak some words, Timmy has a severe intellectual disability. His face carries the unmistakable marks of consanguinity, facial asymmetry, serious dental problems, and an empty look that reveals decades of social isolation. The youngest, Freddie, is the only one who can maintain basic conversations. But even he shows clear signs of cognitive impairment. What shocks most are not just the visible physical deformities, but the naturalness with which this family accepts their condition. For them, this is the only reality they know. There are no mirrors in the house. No television shows other families. No references from the outside world allow them to understand how profoundly different they are. The house where they live is a heap of rooms without electric light, without running water, without any modern comfort. The smell of mold and abandonment impregnates every corner. In the backyard, piles of trash accumulated for years create mountains of debris. It is impossible to determine where the garbage ends and what they consider personal belongings begins. Check if you are already registered with this channel, because this is one of the most extreme and documented consanguinity stories ever recorded in the United States, and you will not find details like this anywhere else. To understand how the Whitaker family reached this point, it is necessary to return to the 19th century when the first settlers settled in the isolated mountains of western Virginia. The Appalachians region has always been characterized by extreme geographical isolation. In deep valleys separated by insurmountable mountains and kilometers of dense forest, entire communities formed. The geography of this region is brutal and merciless, creating narrow and isolated valleys where small communities have developed their own culture, language, and traditions throughout generations. Mountains rise abruptly to over 1,200 meters of altitude. During the winter, snowfall can completely isolate these communities for consecutive months, forcing families to depend exclusively on themselves. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist specializing in isolated populations, explains that when small groups are geographically isolated for generations, the genetic pool becomes progressively more limited. What happened in the Appalachians is a classic example of genetic drift in small founding populations, says Wells in his research published in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 2018. Wells continues to explain the concept of a population bottleneck. When a population is dramatically reduced and remains isolated, it loses the available genetic diversity, creating a vicious cycle that eventually leads to mandatory consanguinity. The documented history of the Appalachians is full of similar examples. During the colonial era, seeking autonomy and isolation from the federal government, whole families migrated to remote valleys. Many of these families brought with them ancient European traditions, including marriage practices already considered problematic at the time. The Whittaker family has its roots documented in the region since 1887, when John Whittaker settled in Odd with his wife, Sarah. American census records show that in the second generation, marriages began to occur between first-degree cousins. In the third generation, marriages between siblings and half-sisters became a common practice, not by choice, but for an absolute lack of options. Preserved in Charleston's historic library, the archives of the local Methodist Church reveal disturbing details about how these unions were religiously formalized. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who served the community between 1920 and 1945, kept meticulous records of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. Their personal diaries, discovered in 2019, contain passages describing their growing concern with the irregular unions he was forced to bless. In an entry dated June 23, 1934, Morrison writes, "Today I performed Mary Whittaker's wedding with her own brother, Henry. The girl is only 16 years old and already carries visible signs of mental disabilities. Henry is not much better. Both are children of a union between father and daughter. Divine blessing." For years, these entries continue, documenting progressively more problematic marriages. Between 1930 and 1940, Morrison records at least 12 unions between first-degree relatives in the Whittaker family. Each entry reveals his growing anguish, but also his sense of powerlessness in the face of a tradition perpetuated regardless of his approval. The isolation was not only geographical, it was cultural, religious, and economic. The Whittaker family belongs to a fundamentalist religious sect that sees the outer world as sinful and corrupt. Marrying outside the family was not only geographically impractical, it was considered a betrayal of family and religious values. Known locally as the Church of the Elected, this sect developed a peculiar theology that justified and even encouraged consanguineous marriages. Doctrinal documents found on the Whittaker property include manuscript sermons that interpret biblical passages as divine commands to maintain the purity of God's lineage. In the fourth generation, the genetic consequences began to speak up. Medical records at Charleston General Hospital, obtained through public information requests, show that between 1920 and 1950, at least 15 children of the Whittaker family were born with severe disabilities. 8 of them died before the age of 5. Prolonged consanguinity results in what geneticists call inbreeding depression. Deleterious recessive genes, which would usually remain inactive when a person marries someone genetically distant, become dominant when both parents carry the same genetic mutations. In the case of the Whittakers, genetic analyses performed by Dr. Michael Bamshad of the University of Washington revealed that today's brothers have a consanguinity coefficient of 0.355, meaning they are genetically closer than would be possible even among normal siblings born of the same parents. This indicates that their parents themselves were the result of multiple consanguineous relationships. To put this number in perspective, Dr. Bamshad explains, a consanguinity coefficient of 0.375 is extraordinarily high. For comparison, children of normal siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. What we see in the Whittakers suggests at least 3 consecutive generations of unions between very close relatives. This level of consanguinity results in what geneticists call extreme homozygosity, a condition where virtually all deleterious recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a medical genetics expert at Johns Hopkins who studied the Whittaker case, describes the situation as a perfect example of the worst possible scenarios of human genetics. Martinez goes on, what we see in the Whittakers is essentially the human equivalent of a highly endogamic laboratory lineage. They have accumulated so many deleterious mutations that it is a miracle they survived to adulthood. Their immune system, neurological development, bone structure, and cardiac function were all compromised by this extreme genetic burden. Detailed genetic tests revealed that the Whittaker brothers carry at least 23 different recessive mutations in a homozygous state, all expressed simultaneously. In a normal population, the probability of a person carrying even 5 of these expressed mutations is astronomically low. The Whittakers represent a statistically impossible convergence of adverse genetic factors. The physical malformations are just the tip of the iceberg. Congenital heart problems, partial deafness, chronic kidney problems, and an extremely compromised immune system are part of the brothers' daily reality. Ray suffers from severe epilepsy with crises that can last hours. Lorraine has respiratory problems that make her constantly gasp as if she were always out of air. The most disturbing aspect is that these brothers represent the survivors. Local church documents indicate that at least 7 other siblings were born dead or died in childhood due to life-incompatible malformations. Paradoxically, the 4 who survived are the less severe cases of a genetic lineage that should have extinguished decades ago. The perpetuation of consanguinity in the Whittaker family cannot be understood only as an individual choice. It is the result of a complex system of isolation, poverty, and ignorance that has been self-perpetuated for over a century. Betty Whittaker, a distant cousin who managed to leave the community in the 1970s, offers a shocking account of how internal family dynamics worked. No one explained anything to anyone, she tells in an interview with documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter. The girls got pregnant with their own brothers, parents, or uncles, and that was seen as normal. There was no sex education. There was no knowledge about genetics. There were no alternatives. Now 73 and living in a home for the elderly in Charleston, Betty carries her own physical and emotional scars of life on the Whittaker property. She has lower deformities in her fingers and slight facial asymmetry, signs that she herself is a product of consanguinity, although to a much smaller degree than her current cousins. I was considered the normal one of the family, Betty remembers bitterly. Because I could read a few words and do simple accounts, it gave me enough courage to escape when I was 19. I walked 15 kilometers down the mountain until I reached the main road, where a truck driver hitchhiked me to Charleston. Betty describes disturbing family rituals that demonstrate how consanguinity was institutionalized within the family. There was a ceremony they called the Blessing of Purity, held when a girl was 14 years old. The patriarch of the family, in my time, it was old Thomas Whittaker, chose which family man would be the guardian of that girl. It did not matter if it was father, brother, uncle, or cousin. The girl had no choice. These guardians had exclusive reproductive rights over the women assigned to them. Betty says that resisting this designation resulted in severe punishment, isolation in a dark basement, food deprivation, and, in extreme cases, beatings that left permanent marks. My younger sister, Rebecca, tried to escape 3 times, Betty remembers with tears in her eyes. The 3rd time, they broke her legs with a hammer to make sure she could never walk far enough to escape. She died at the age of 23, giving birth to her 5th son. All 5 babies were from our own father. Betty describes an environment where incest was not only tolerated but encouraged by family patriarchs as a way to maintain the purity of the lineage and ensure that family properties were not divided with strangers. Old John always said that Whittaker blood was pure blood and that mixing with others was a sin. Raleigh County Social Assistance records, obtained through public information requests, reveal that between 1960 and 2000, at least 23 Whittaker children were recorded with the same father listed on the birth certificates of mothers who were their own daughters or sisters. The legal system simply ignored these irregularities, treating the family as a lost cause. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. How does a society allow this to happen for so many generations? For the current Whittakers, formal education never existed. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie never attended school. They do not know how to read, write, or do basic math. Their only source of knowledge about the world comes from conversations with equally isolated and ignorant relatives. For them, their condition is normal because it is the only reality they know. The most tragic aspect is that the cycle continues. Freddie, despite his cognitive limitations, has had at least 2 relationships with first-degree cousins. One of these relationships resulted in the birth of a child who died at 3 months of age due to severe heart malformations. The second resulted in a miscarriage in the 5th month of gestation. Dr. Robin Bennett, a genetic counselor at the University of Washington, explains that when the consanguinity coefficient reaches levels such as those observed in the Whittaker family, the likelihood of birth defects and severe diseases exceeds 50%. It is statistically more likely that a child is born with severe problems than is born healthy. The family lives exclusively on government benefits, approximately $800 monthly dollars for disabilities, that barely cover their basic needs. They depend on the charity of neighbors for food and clothing. Once a month, a van from the local church brings basic groceries, canned beans, rice, old bread, and non-existent milk. The nearest health unit is 45 kilometers away, and the Whittakers have no means of transport. They do not know social forms of entertainment besides sitting on the porch and observing the few cars passing by on the dirt road. Their existence is silent and without perspective. My first reaction was pure shock, Leiter admits in an interview. But then it came to me, how could a family in such extreme conditions have remained completely invisible to the authorities for so long? The path to their home is literally a land path created by the wear of decades of use by a single family. When I finally got home, I thought I was looking at a horror movie scene. The photographer says he initially had difficulty understanding that he was looking at humans. Ray was sitting on the porch, and honestly, my first thought was that it was some kind of sculpture or haunted doll. When he moved and made those sounds, that's when I realized I was facing something I had never imagined could exist. Leiter tried to establish basic communication but quickly realized the family's extreme limitations. Freddie was the only one who could form recognizable words, but even his answers were limited to yes, no, and some loose words. I asked how old he was, and he answered a lot. I asked where he was born, and he pointed to the ground. The answer reveals deep systemic failures in American society. Raleigh County, where the Whittakers live, is one of the poorest and most neglected regions of Western Virginia. With a population of only 78,000 inhabitants spread over an area of 600 kilometers, social services are scarce and overloaded. Internal documents from the Department of Social Services, obtained through access to information litigation, reveal that local authorities were aware of the Whittaker family's situation for decades but consciously chose to ignore it. It was not ignorance, it was a conscious political decision to treat the Whittaker family as a problem that simply did not exist. The documents reveal at least 8 social worker reports between 1985 and 2005 describing subhuman conditions on the Whittaker property. Each report recommended immediate intervention, and each report was filed without action by supervisors who considered the case intractable and without resolution. Morrison, a social worker who worked in the region for 15 years, explains, there are hundreds of isolated families in these mountains that live in precarious conditions. The resources are limited, and cases like the Whittakers require a type of expert intervention that is simply not available in poor rural counties. The educational system has also completely failed the family. Western Virginia Education Department records show that during the 1980s, school frequency control agents tried to force the children to attend school. All attempts were frustrated by family resistance and by the children's physical and mental condition. Children with a strong smell, unable to communicate properly. The other children were scared, and the teachers had no training to deal with such severe disabilities. The negligence was not just educational. Local newspaper Charleston Gazette-Mail reports from 1995 and 2003 document at least 2 investigations by the Department of Social Services into improper living conditions on the Whitaker property. Both investigations resulted in reports that were filed without any concrete action. The Whitakers expose the hypocrisy of a society that is proud of its family values but completely abandons families that do not fit into normative standards. The local community itself has developed an ambiguous relationship with the Whitakers. Some neighbors show genuine compassion, carrying food and clothes occasionally. Others see them as a local shame that should be hidden from external visitors. They see the family's condition as a divine curse or payment for ancestral sins. If this family is like this, it is because God has a purpose that we are not to understand. This fatalistic resignation permeated for decades any attempt at external intervention. The Whitaker family has not only been forgotten by the system, it was actively ignored by a community that preferred to treat it as an invisible problem. The history of the Whitaker family transcends the sensationalism of extreme consanguinity. It speaks of American rural poverty, institutional negligence, failures of the health and education systems, and the systematic abandonment of marginalized populations. Subsequent genetic studies have revealed that the Whitaker family is not an isolated case in the Appalachians region. What makes the Whitaker case unique is not the consanguinity itself, but the extreme temporal duration and the complete absence of external intervention, explains Bamshad. They represent a natural experiment on the limits of human survival in adverse genetic conditions. But they have also transformed the Whitakers into a kind of human zoo attraction. More and more tourists began to appear on the property, taking pictures and videos as if they were animals on display. This additional exploitation raised complex ethical questions about consent and human dignity. Media attention brought some practical improvements. Donations from viewers have allowed minor reforms in the house, the installation of a generator for basic electricity, a functional bathroom, and more regular access to medical care. Now 65, Lorraine develops progressive respiratory problems. They are, literally, the last of their species, a family that has reproduced to extinction. But the history of the Whitakers also serves as a warning. In the poorest rural regions of America, there are thousands of families living in conditions of extreme social, educational, and medical vulnerability. Geographic isolation combined with poverty and institutional negligence creates conditions where similar tragedies can develop silently. Dr. Williams, a social anthropologist at the University of Virginia who has studied isolated Appalachian communities for 20 years, notes that the Whitaker family is not an anomaly. It is the extreme result of social trends that affect thousands of families in the region. Multidimensional poverty, cultural isolation, and government abandonment create ecosystems where human tragedies like this can be perpetuated for generations. Williams documented at least 47 other families in the Appalachians region with significant consanguinity histories, although none has reached the extreme levels of the Whitakers. What we see is a vulnerability gradient, she explains. The Whitaker family represents the most extreme point of a spectrum of social neglect that affects the entire region. The parallels are disturbing. Families such as the Fugates, known for the blue skin caused by consanguinity, or the Hartwells, whose limbs suffer from dwarfism and hereditary cognitive disabilities, show that the Whitakers are not an isolated case. They are simply the most extreme example of a regional pattern of isolation and endogamy. Research driven by the Appalachian Health Initiative reveals that consanguinity rates in isolated mountain communities can be 15 to 20 times higher than national averages. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who leads this initiative, states, "We're dealing with a public health crisis that has been ignored for decades." The Whitaker family represents the most severe endpoint of what happens when geographic isolation combines with economic desperation and social abandonment. The true Whitaker family lesson is not in its deformed genetics, but in what its existence reveals about the deep failures of a society that refuses to take care of its most vulnerable members. They are an uncomfortable mirror that reflects not only physical deformities but the moral and social deformities of a system that leaves behind those who need protection the most. Dr. Bennett offers a dark final perspective. From a purely scientific point of view, the Whittaker family represents what happens when natural selection is artificially suspended. Under natural conditions, individuals with so many genetic deficiencies would not survive until reproductive age. What kept this family alive were not their genes. This persistence, however, comes at an immeasurable human cost. Each day in the life of the Whittaker brothers is a struggle against limitations that no human being should face. Their existence is simultaneously a testimony of human resilience and a devastating accusation against a society that allows such suffering to be perpetuated. Today, as you watch this story comfortably at home with access to education, health, and opportunities, the Whittaker brothers remain in their home without electricity, without hope, and without a future. They are ghosts of an America that we prefer to pretend does not exist, but which continues to exist, hidden in the forgotten folds of a country proud of its opportunities for everyone. The Whittaker family will die in silence, as it lived. But its history will remain as a permanent testimony to what happens when a society decides that some lives simply do not matter enough to be saved. They are the human price of institutionalized neglect, the genetic cost of social abandonment, and the living proof that some tragedies are entirely avoidable if we only care enough to prevent them. Their lives are a question directly directed to our collective conscience. If a society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, what does the existence of the Whittaker family say about who we really are? If you are not registered yet, subscribe now, because stories like this reveal truths that few have the courage to tell. If you watched so far, it is because you were impacted by this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really follows the channel. Leave your like if this story impacted you in any way. Share this video so that more people understand the realities our society prefers to ignore.